The last rays of the evening sun stretched across the rolling plains of the American frontier, painting the dry grass in shades of amber and gold. Autumn had settled gently over the land, and a cool breeze whispered through the cottonwood trees that lined a narrow wagon trail leading toward the distant hills. It was the late 1800s, a time when every mile demanded patience, every meal required effort, and every stranger carried a story. Joseph Mercer, 33 years old, walked slowly along a familiar deer path with an empty game sack resting against his shoulder. His boots were worn smooth from years of hunting, and the faded brown coat he wore had been carefully patched more than once. The day had brought little success. The rabbits had vanished into thick brush, and even the deer seemed to know where a lonely hunter might be waiting. He stopped for a moment near the edge of a ridge overlooking the valley where his cabin stood. It was small, built from rough pine logs, with smoke drifting lazily from its stone chimney. Beside it stood an old wooden barn that had once sheltered 2 horses but now held little more than hay, a few tools, and stacks of firewood gathered before winter. Joseph sighed quietly. He had never imagined his life would become so small. When he was a boy, his father had dreamed of building a thriving homestead where neighbors gathered after harvest and children laughed beneath apple trees. But illness had taken his father long before those dreams could grow. Debt claimed most of their land, leaving Joseph with only the cabin, the barn, and enough wilderness to hunt for survival. Many people in the nearby settlement considered him unlucky. Some even whispered that hardship followed wherever Joseph settled. He never argued with them. Instead, he greeted everyone with quiet respect, traded fairly when he had extra meat, and accepted life's disappointments without bitterness. His mother had once told him, "A man may own little, Joseph, but he alone decides whether his heart becomes poor." Those words remained with him long after she was gone. As the sun dipped lower, Joseph began walking toward home. The silence of the valley usually comforted him, but that evening something unusual caught his attention. Far down the wagon trail, 2 figures moved slowly through the fading light. He narrowed his eyes. An elderly woman leaned heavily on a walking stick, pausing every few steps to catch her breath. Beside her walked a younger woman carrying 2 worn leather bags, supporting the older traveler whenever the road became uneven. Neither appeared dangerous. Neither appeared wealthy, only tired. Joseph hesitated. Travelers rarely came this way unless they had lost their direction or hoped to avoid the crowded stagecoach routes farther south. The younger woman noticed him first. She gently touched the older woman's arm and pointed toward the ridge. Both stopped. For a brief moment, none of them spoke. Joseph slowly descended the slope until they stood only a few yards apart. The older woman's silver hair escaped beneath a faded bonnet, and exhaustion showed plainly across her weathered face. Though her clothes were old, they had been carefully cleaned and mended. The younger woman, perhaps 28 years old, carried herself with quiet dignity despite obvious fatigue. Her hazel eyes remained calm, and there was kindness in the way she supported the woman beside her. Joseph removed his hat politely. "Evening," he said. The younger woman offered a grateful smile, but before she could answer, the elderly widow drew a careful breath and stepped forward. "Sir," she said gently, her voice trembling with weariness, "we have been walking since sunrise." She glanced toward the small barn near Joseph's cabin. Then, with quiet dignity rather than desperation, she asked, "Would you allow us to spend just one night in your barn?" Joseph looked from the elderly widow to the young woman beside her. He owned little enough for himself, and winter was only weeks away. Every blanket mattered. Every scoop of grain stored in the barn had a purpose. Yet he also remembered long journeys with his parents when a stranger's kindness had meant the difference between hope and despair. "You don't need to sleep in the barn," he said quietly. "It's old and drafty." "The cabin isn't much better, but it's warmer." The widow immediately shook her head. "We couldn't ask that of you. You didn't, Joseph replied with a faint smile. I offered. Virginia's eyes widened with surprise. Thank you, she said softly. You've already done more than we expected. Inside the cabin, Joseph stirred the last of his vegetable stew over the fire. There was only enough for 2 generous bowls or 3 modest ones. Without hesitation, he divided it equally into 3 wooden bowls and placed them on the table. When Virginia noticed that his own portion was noticeably smaller, she pretended not to see. Pride could be as fragile as hunger. The widow ate slowly, grateful for every spoonful. Warmth returned to her face as the fire crackled gently nearby. The simple cabin, though plain, felt peaceful. Every tool hung neatly on the wall. Every shelf had been carefully organized. It was the home of a man who respected honest work, even if fortune had seldom rewarded him. My name is Eleanor, the widow said after supper. This is my daughter, Virginia. Joseph, he answered. No one spoke for several moments. Outside, crickets sang beneath the clear evening sky and the last light faded beyond the distant hills. Finally, Joseph asked, Where are you headed? Virginia folded her hands. We're hoping to reach Millstone Crossing. My mother's cousin may still live there. We haven't heard from him in years, but we have nowhere else to go. Eleanor lowered her eyes. Since my husband passed away, life has become difficult. She did not complain or ask for sympathy. She simply stated the truth. Joseph nodded with quiet understanding. I know something about difficult, he said. Virginia studied him for a moment. There was sadness in his face, but no bitterness. That surprised her more than anything else. Later, Joseph spread 2 clean blankets beside the fireplace while insisting he was comfortable sleeping in the rocking chair. You've already shared your supper, Virginia protested. I've slept there before. Comfortably. He smiled. Comfortably enough. She realized he was protecting their dignity by pretending the arrangement was ordinary. As Eleanor rested, Virginia quietly washed the wooden bowls and placed them neatly beside the sink. Joseph thanked her, though she insisted it was the least she could do. The silence between them became easy rather than awkward. You live here alone? Virginia asked. Joseph nodded. For a long time now. Doesn't it become lonely? He looked toward the glowing fire. Sometimes. But loneliness can teach a person to notice small blessings. Virginia considered those words carefully. Before retiring for the night, Eleanor reached into one of the worn travel bags and removed a small cloth bundle. I can't repay your kindness, she said, but please accept these. Inside were several carefully dried apple slices. Joseph smiled warmly. They're worth more than money this time of year. He accepted only one slice and gently returned the bundle. You'll need the rest for your journey. The widow's eyes filled with quiet gratitude. Long after everyone had settled down, Joseph remained awake, staring into the fading embers. His cabin no longer felt empty. Gentle conversation had replaced silence. Soft laughter had replaced the creaking of old walls. Then he heard it. A delicate melody floated through the darkness. For one impossible moment, Joseph thought someone was playing a piano. He almost stood to search for the sound before realizing the truth. Virginia was softly humming in her sleep. The tune carried the warmth of forgotten family evenings and peaceful homes he had almost forgotten could exist. It drifted gently through the little cabin until even the wind outside seemed to pause and listen. Joseph closed his eyes. For the first time in many months, he did not feel alone. He had offered nothing more than a warm meal, a safe roof, and a little kindness to 2 weary strangers. Yet somehow, in the quiet stillness of that autumn night, the lonely hunter sensed that this unexpected meeting was not the end of a journey. It was the quiet beginning of a future none of them could yet imagine. Morning sunlight slipped gently through the cabin windows, replacing the glow of the dying fire with soft, golden light. Joseph woke before dawn, as he always did, but for the first time in many months, the cabin no longer felt silent. The quiet breathing of his unexpected guests reminded him that kindness had a way of changing even the smallest places. He stepped outside to gather fresh water from the nearby creek and returned with enough to prepare breakfast. The meal was simple: cornbread warmed over the stove, a few eggs collected from the neighbor who traded them for rabbit meat each week, and fresh herbal tea made from wild mint growing near the hillside. When Virginia entered the room, she smiled with surprise. "You've already been working." Joseph shrugged. "Old habits." Eleanor joined them slowly, leaning on her walking stick. Though the warmth of the cabin had restored some color to her face, her breathing remained shallow. She thanked Joseph for another meal, insisting they should continue their journey before taking any more of his generosity. After breakfast, they packed their two worn travel bags. Joseph walked with them toward the wagon trail, carrying one of the heavier bags despite Virginia's gentle protests. They had traveled only a short distance when Eleanor suddenly stopped. Her hand trembled against the walking stick. The color drained from her face. Before either of them could react, her knees weakened beneath her. Joseph caught her before she struck the ground. Virginia knelt beside her mother, frightened but trying to remain calm. "Mother." Eleanor opened her eyes after several long moments. "I'm all right." Her voice sounded weaker than before. Joseph looked toward the trail stretching across the empty valley. The nearest settlement was still many miles away. Asking Eleanor to continue would place her in serious danger. He made his decision without hesitation. "You aren't going anywhere today." Virginia looked up. "We've already burdened you enough." "No," Joseph replied firmly. "You've accepted help. There's a difference." Carefully they returned to the cabin, where Eleanor rested beside the fireplace while Joseph fetched cool water and fresh blankets. The unexpected delay changed the rhythm of the day. While Eleanor slept peacefully, Virginia quietly searched for ways to repay Joseph's kindness. She swept the wooden floor. She washed the windows until sunlight filled every corner. She carefully stitched a loose seam in Joseph's hunting coat after finding a needle and thread tucked inside a small wooden box. Joseph returned from splitting firewood and paused in the doorway. "You didn't have to do all this." Virginia smiled without looking up from her work. "Neither did you." For the first time in years, someone else moved naturally around the cabin. The empty shelves seemed less lonely. The quiet rooms felt warmer. That afternoon Joseph prepared several rabbit snares for the following morning. Virginia watched carefully before asking if she could help. He explained each knot patiently. She listened with genuine curiosity, repeating every step until she tied one correctly. "My father enjoyed learning practical things," she said softly. "He believed every honest skill deserved respect." Joseph nodded. "My father said nearly the same." The shared memory surprised them both. Two families who had never met, two fathers gone too soon, yet somehow their lessons sounded remarkably alike. Later, Virginia wandered outside carrying a small cloth bundle of seeds she had protected throughout their journey. Near the cabin she found a sunny patch of earth and gently planted wild herbs, sage, thyme, and chamomile. Joseph watched from the porch. "They'll take time to grow," he said. Virginia covered the final seeds with care. "Good things usually do." Those simple words lingered in Joseph's thoughts long after the afternoon breeze carried their conversation into the quiet valley. That evening, Eleanor felt strong enough to sit outside beneath the fading light. Joseph placed an old wooden chair beside the porch, while Virginia prepared tea from the wild mint growing near the creek. The valley stretched peacefully before them, touched by the warm colors of sunset. Birds settled into the trees, and the distant hills stood quietly against the darkening sky. For a long while none of them spoke. The silence was comfortable. It belonged to people who no longer felt like strangers. Finally, Joseph broke it. "I never expected my life to end up like this." Virginia looked toward him. "What did you expect?" He smiled faintly. "When I was younger, I thought I'd own a proper homestead someday. Maybe raise horses. maybe have children running through the yard. He looked at his weathered hands. After my father died, the debts swallowed nearly everything. I kept the cabin, the barn, and little else. After that, I stopped making plans. Virginia listened without interruption. My mother always said hope is easier to lose than money, she replied, but it is much harder to earn back. Joseph nodded slowly. I suppose she's right. Alina reached into one of the old leather bags resting beside her chair. From the bottom, she carefully removed a folded packet wrapped in faded cloth. I've carried this for many years, she said quietly. She unfolded the cloth to reveal several yellowed sheets of paper marked with careful lines, measurements, and handwritten notes. Joseph accepted them gently. A survey. My husband's, Alina answered. Before illness took him, he spent years exploring these hills. He believed there was a spring hidden somewhere beyond the northern ridge. Virginia smiled softly. Everyone laughed at him. They called him a dreamer, Alina continued. They said no one searches that long unless he's chasing stories instead of truth. Joseph studied the worn map. The careful markings showed ridges, old oak trees, unusual rock formations, and directions measured by the stars rather than roads. Why keep it all these years? He asked. Because he never stopped believing he was right. The next morning, after making certain Alina felt stronger, Joseph packed a small bag with bread, dried meat, and a water flask. I'm going to take a look. Virginia stood. I'll come. He shook his head kindly. Stay with your mother. If the map is wrong, I'll return by supper. If it's right, he smiled. We'll know soon enough. The climb into the hills demanded patience. Fallen trees blocked narrow paths and thick brush covered much of the ground. More than once Joseph wondered whether the old survey had been little more than hopeful guesswork. Still, he trusted the careful details. Near midday, he reached an unusual cluster of limestone rocks matching one of the map's markings. Beyond them, he heard something unexpected: flowing water. He pushed aside tangled branches and stepped into a small clearing hidden from every nearby trail. Before him, crystal-clear water bubbled steadily from the base of a rocky hillside, filling a narrow stream that disappeared through rich, dark soil. Joseph knelt beside the spring. The water was cold, clean, and constant. He looked across the surrounding valley. The land could support gardens, orchards, perhaps even several family farms. He smiled, not because he imagined becoming wealthy, but because one man's forgotten faith had quietly survived the passing of years. Returning to the cabin before sunset, Joseph shared the remarkable discovery with Alina and Virginia. Alina closed her eyes, tears slipping gently down her cheeks. He was right, she whispered. Joseph folded the survey carefully and placed it back into her hands. Tomorrow, he said, I'll report everything honestly. Virginia looked at him with quiet admiration. You could keep the secret. Joseph shook his head. If something good begins with a lie, he said gently, it never stays good. For the first time since arriving, the three of them looked toward the future with shared hope. Unaware that the greatest blessings were still waiting just beyond the horizon, news of the hidden spring spread slowly across the valley, carried not by excitement alone, but by careful verification. Joseph accompanied the town surveyor and two respected settlers back into the hills, following the old map exactly as Alina's late husband had drawn it many years before. Every landmark matched. Every measurement proved accurate. When they finally reached the spring, the men stood in silent amazement as clear water flowed steadily from the rocky hillside, untouched by drought or season. Within weeks, local officials confirmed the discovery. The surrounding land was suitable for farming, and plans were made to divide nearby parcels fairly among families willing to work them. Joseph refused every suggestion that he claim more than his rightful share. The map belonged to another man, he said. I only followed his footsteps. His honesty earned something far more valuable than wealth. It earned trust. The community agreed that Joseph should receive fair compensation for reporting the spring instead of hiding it. The payment was modest but enough to repair his cabin, strengthen the old barn, and purchase a sturdy mule that made hunting and hauling supplies much easier. Joseph accepted with quiet gratitude. "I have enough," he often said. Meanwhile, Elena remained at the cabin while her strength slowly faded. Though illness still burdened her body, peace had replaced the uncertainty she had carried for so many years. Each morning she sat on the porch wrapped in a warm quilt, watching wagons travel toward the valley where new fields were beginning to appear. Virginia stayed constantly at her mother's side, but also found joy in helping neighbors establish their new homes. She shared the herbs she had planted beside Joseph's cabin, teaching children how each one could be used for cooking or simple remedies. Before long, tiny gardens bloomed outside several cabins, filling the valley with the scent of sage, thyme, and chamomile. Joseph noticed something remarkable. People had begun visiting his home not because they needed charity, but because they enjoyed the company. Some evenings neighbors gathered on the porch after finishing their work. One brought fresh bread. Another carried apples. Someone else arrived with a fiddle, filling the quiet valley with cheerful music until stars covered the sky. The lonely hunter who had once eaten supper in silence now found every chair occupied. One afternoon, Joseph and Virginia repaired the porch railing together. They worked side by side, speaking little, yet every shared task felt comfortable. There was no need for grand promises or dramatic declarations. Respect had quietly grown into friendship. Friendship had gently become affection. As they rested beneath the shade of an old oak tree, Virginia looked across the valley where children laughed beside the new stream flowing from the spring. "My father always believed water brought people together," she said. Joseph smiled. "I think he was right about more than the spring." She looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" He watched a family unloading supplies near their newly built cabin. "Some discoveries change the land," he answered. "Others change the people who live on it." Virginia lowered her eyes, unable to hide her smile. Neither of them realized Elena had quietly watched the conversation from the porch. She smiled too, grateful that hope had finally found a home where sorrow had once lived. As winter gave way to spring, the valley blossomed with new life. Fresh fences marked thriving gardens, orchards began taking root, and laughter echoed where silence had once ruled. Families who had struggled for years now worked together instead of competing for scarce resources. The spring never failed them, and neither did the spirit of cooperation it inspired. Eleanor's health continued to decline, but her heart seemed lighter with each passing day. One peaceful afternoon she asked Joseph and Virginia to sit beside her on the porch. Resting across her lap was a small wooden box that had belonged to her late husband. She opened it carefully. Inside lay an old brass compass, polished by years of careful use. "My husband carried this wherever he traveled," she said softly. "He believed a good compass points more than the way across the land." She turned toward Joseph and placed it gently into his hands. "I prayed my daughter would someday meet a man who follows true north, not only with his feet but with his heart." Joseph lowered his eyes, deeply moved. "I don't know if I deserve this." Elena smiled warmly. "You earned it the moment you chose kindness when you had almost nothing." Virginia reached for Joseph's hand. This time, neither of them let go. Several weeks later, Elena passed away peacefully in her sleep. She left the world knowing her husband's dream had been proven true, and her daughter would never again face the future alone. The entire community gathered to honor her life. No grand speeches were needed. Neighbors simply shared stories of her courage, her quiet wisdom, and the hope she had carried through years of hardship. When spring returned the following year, Joseph asked Virginia to marry him beneath the large oak tree overlooking the valley. His proposal was simple. "I cannot promise riches," he said, "but I promise honesty, hard work, and a home where kindness is never in short supply." Virginia smiled through happy tears. That's everything I've ever wanted. Together they expanded the little cabin room by room, never building more than they truly needed. The old barn remained standing beside it, repaired with sturdy timber but still carrying the humble character that had first welcomed two weary travelers. Virginia filled the porch with flowers. Joseph planted apple trees in memory of Alina and her husband. Years passed. Children played beside the spring that had transformed the valley. Travelers often stopped to refill their water barrels before continuing westward. Whenever someone arrived late in the evening with nowhere to stay, Joseph never forgot the lesson that had quietly changed his own life. Above the barn door he hung a simple wooden sign. If you need one safe night, you are welcome. Many accepted the invitation. Some stayed only until sunrise. Others returned years later simply to say thank you. One autumn evening, a young traveler looked at the sign and asked Joseph, "Why would you trust strangers so easily?" Joseph glanced toward Virginia, who was gathering herbs near the porch exactly as she had on the day she planted the first small garden. He smiled gently before answering, "Because once, long ago, someone trusted me enough to ask for help." The traveler nodded thoughtfully. As the sun settled behind the western hills, golden light covered the cabin, the barn, the spring, and the valley beyond. Joseph realized that true wealth had never been measured by the size of a man's land or the weight of his purse. It was measured by the doors he chose to keep open for others, and that quiet choice became the greatest legacy of all.